This episode of the Multiracialverse podcast is brought to you by Eviton Couture, a brand born from a powerful vision and a deep connection to heritage. Founded by Shinnecock brothers Jason Tech King and Wayon Moon Smith, Eviton represents resilience and pride. From handmade tie-dye to wellness-focused athletic wear, each piece is crafted with intention and positivity, smudged with sage for good vibes, and delivered to you with love. Join the Eviton family on their journey of empowerment and inspiration. Hit up Moon on Instagram at Eviton_KS. That is native spelled backwards _KS to view product and place an order. Eviton Couture. Feel the spirit of resilience in every stitch.
You know, people would see me with my white mother and, I don't know what their initial assumption would be at first. But then I would run into situations where kids didn't want to hang out with me because if it was a white group of children, they thought I was tainted. We grew up at a time still, especially like when I was in Florida, where, there was definitely still a lot of outward racism when it came to, whether you were Black or brown. And then when it came to hanging out with Black children, I would be told that I was too white. Because of, maybe it's because I acted in a certain way, or because I spoke too properly, or I was just smart and I, raised my hand and all of this stuff. And so I was always caught in this interesting dynamic.
Welcome to episode 20 of the Multiracialverse. I am your host, Antonio Fernandez. And today we're bringing you part one of a powerful and inspiring conversation. Today's guest is Teisha Gillespie, who shares her incredible journey navigating life as a biracial individual with a white mother and an African-American father. Growing up, she faced exclusion and judgment from both communities. And not only did she face challenges with her racial identity, but she also navigated the world with a visual disability called retinitis pigmentosa. In this episode, Teisha opens up about the struggles of not fitting into predefined racial categories, the lack of conversations around race and identity in her family, and how she's broken through the stereotypes and misconceptions about race and ability. Plus, we'll dive into her successful career in marketing, her self-advocacy, and her amazing podcast, Not Your Average Goat, where she sheds light on people's stories of resilience and strength. Let's celebrate differences and dismantle stigma with Teisha's inspiring story. You won't want to miss this. Hello, Teisha. Welcome to the Multiracialverse. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you so much, Antonio, for having me. I'm so excited to just sit down and talk to you. We have so much to go over, and I think a lot of what we're going to talk about, I haven't really done a deep dive with many other people, so I'm just personally excited to maybe discover something new about myself today.
Yeah, that's awesome. I really love that open-mindedness and that approach. I've been listening to some of your episodes, and I know that one of the I think I've either seen comments that individuals who've been on there have made and some reviews about how you ask some of the toughest questions. So I was like, hey, maybe I can give Teisha, a little taste of some tougher questions about herself. So, but let's start with the easy one. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your parents' background, and where you were born.
I was born in Maryland. I'm the oldest of 7 children. And I was born into a biracial family. So my mom is white, primarily. Her family is German. And then my dad is an African-American man, and his family is both, has Nigerian roots as well as Italian roots. And so born in Maryland, then moved to Florida, basically traveled all over the Tampa Bay area from about the age of 1 until about 7, until I moved back to Maryland. And that's where I stayed until I made my way into Virginia back in 2015 for work. And so oldest of 7 children, My mom and dad were married for until I was about 9 or 10, and then they were divorced. And then my mom did end up getting remarried when I was about 12, and then got divorced again around 17. And so, I kind of had this interesting dynamic of, not just being in a big family with all girls, actually. I should probably say that, with one bathroom most of the times. So there was always tons of drama and chaos and who stole my shirt and all of this stuff. But I also just didn't really have, growing up as a brown person with a white mother, who was mostly a single mother. My dad and my mom, even though they were married, my dad oftentimes was spending time at work, hanging out with friends. And so I didn't really even get to see him very much. And then when we moved back to Maryland, my dad actually stayed in Florida. And so I might have seen him maybe 1 or 2 weekends a year. And then my stepdad, again, kind of, was in the picture for a few years. But again, there really wasn't that tight bondness. There were also some unfortunate situations that kind of happened while my mom and my stepdad were married. And so, I had this interesting thing where, I kind of had 3 parents at one time, but at the same time, I really only had one. And a lot of the time, I actually saw myself as my own parent because I was the oldest.
Yeah.
My mom, had a lot of struggles. A lot of the times, what they talk about now, growing up with an immature parent or an emotionally immature parent. And my mom, a lot of the time, could fall into that. And so, low socioeconomic kind of household. My mom, rarely kept a job, did not have a formal education. I'm not even sure she had her GED. And so there were just a lot of things that potentially could have held me back, especially being a brown female, having a disability. And, for me, I really had to kind of figure out how to navigate the world on my own in many aspects. And thankfully, I had some really great teachers and educators. And my grandparents actually, I think, were more, better parents to me sometimes than my actual parents were, because they really pushed me to do really well in school. And, they would come by and give me allowances and, just really there to cheer me on. And unfortunately, I didn't really get that on a regular basis with my own family. And then, of course, having multiple different identities, a lot of the times, thinking back to the 90s, many of the children who I interacted with in school, there was definitely a lot of kind of shaming around some of my identities as well. So many times where I didn't have a lot of positivity around me, but I've really tried to kind of grow into a person where I feel very personally strong, but then I also try to find multiple ways of kind of giving back to people who have maybe come from similar backgrounds as me.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that so candidly. And definitely we'll talk about the inspirational work you do in many ways here as we move along in your journey. Were all your siblings, were they from the same father and mother?
So 4 of us were from the same dad, and then my 3 younger siblings were from my mom and my stepdad. So what my husband actually calls 2 litters. Yeah, so we were actually pretty spread out. So my youngest sister is actually 14 years younger than me. And so, a lot of the times they didn't feel like sisters like my older ones did. And they actually felt more like nieces. And, I left home when my youngest siblings were, 3, 4, and 6. And so I really didn't even get to know them very well. And so, I entered my 20s and, they kind of, I would be the one to kind of pick them up and take them out to the zoo or take them to dinner or something. So I kind of felt like that aunt almost to them.
Yeah. So what was your journey with your identity like? You mentioned there were definitely instances, in elementary school, starting in elementary school, around being bullied or harassed for the way you looked. What was can you remember possibly, one or two of your first instances with that feeling of otherness, but also I'm interested in, because it sounds like at that time your mom, was doing most of the raising of the children. How was your relationship with her from the perspective of something happens at school and then you go home and talk to her about it? How did she handle that?
Yeah, that's a really great question because, there wasn't a lot of talking that happened. I think a lot of the times, not just in the situation that I was raised in, but I think a lot of times, especially back then, there wasn't a lot of talking with children about how to have difficult conversations. And my home didn't always feel like a safe place to me. So I oftentimes wouldn't share. And I'm also an introvert too. And I was very quiet when I was younger. So a lot of the times I would keep those things to myself. And I would say that when it came to school, the biggest thing for me was kind of that my biracial identity at the time. People would see me with my white mother and, I don't know what their initial assumption would be at first. But then I would run into situations where kids didn't want to hang out with me because if it was a white group of children, they thought I was tainted. We grew up at a time still, especially like when I was in Florida, where, there was definitely still a lot of outward racism when it came to, whether you were black or brown. And then when it came to hanging out with black children, I would be told that I was too white. Because of, maybe it's because I acted in a certain way, or because I spoke too properly, or I was just smart and I, raised my hand and all of this stuff. And so I was always caught in this interesting dynamic. And I would say probably, my friends always looked very differently. And my friends were oftentimes what other kids would label as the loner. Because, even though, I was able to find friends who are white and also find friends who are black or brown or Hispanic or Asian, but we oftentimes had like our own little things that made us misfits. And so it made us kind of gravitate toward each other. And so, one time I remember when I was in Florida, I had actually gone back for a few months for middle school. And I was sitting at a table by myself because I was still very new. And I just remember these kids, they were obviously talking about me. And they were like, yeah, she's the Oreo baby, like the new Oreo baby. And I had never heard that before. And that was actually one thing that I went home and talked to my mom about. And then she explained to me, when, children come from parents who are multiple races, it's kind of just like an actual Oreo, like the black and the white. And that just, I don't know, it made me feel excluded, made me feel very different. And then on top of that, also having a visual disability, there were many things that I was facing exclusion from, either because people didn't think I could do something, or there were actually times where it was very difficult for me to do something. So like thinking about an obstacle course at gym, sometimes that was very harsh for me to do because I could very easily kind of trip over something because my depth perception isn't very good. So like seeing like steps or curbs or things like that, those are things that are very hard for me to detect. And so it definitely made it very challenging. I felt like as if kids made fun of me for, like, they were either going to make fun of me because I was, had a visual disability, or if they were okay with that, they would find a reason to make fun of me because of my skin color, or because I came from, like a mismatched racial family. It's so interesting. I recall this odd moment. Like I said, my younger siblings were a huge age gap between us. And I remember, after my mom and my stepfather got divorced, my one sister, I think she was about 3, and we were on a walk. And, she was reflecting. She was quite an insightful 3-year-old, but she made this comment saying, well, maybe now mommy can find someone who looks like her. And it was just so shocking to me because, just to have this 3-year-old reflect on, kind of, like subconsciously getting, like soaking in these comments and this atmosphere that's created. Kind of like this quote unquote wrongness that your parents don't look the same. And like, that's something a 3-year-old should never even have to consider, or no one really should ever have to, contemplate that. So, I would say it's sometimes hard to explain, and it really caused me a lot of confusion with who I was because, as I got older, and if I would try to explain to people, they were like, people would look at me and they were like, where are you from? Like, are you, a lot of people would assume I'm Puerto Rican or, belong to the Latinx or Hispanic community. And I only have like 2.5% of like Peruvian. But, and so, I would say firstly, a lot of the times it would sometimes be easier to just lean into that identity and not correct them because I felt as if I got judged less. People, it could be easy explained why I was brown and have the hair color, the hair type that I do. If I was like, oh yeah, I'm Hispanic or I'm Latinx. But then when I would try to explain to them, well, actually I'm Black, then I would get the comment, later on when I was starting to develop a little bit more and like, you're not Black, Teisha, like you're so white. And I'm like, what does that mean? And again, it would go back to my personality, the way I talk, because apparently Black people can't talk properly. They can't have the kind of personality that I have, which, there's definitely a lot that could be said around that too. And even today, I think there's still a lot of judgment and just these preconceived notions of what it means to be Black or what it means to be white. And I hear a lot of the times that, people say like, we shouldn't see color. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think we should really celebrate all of our differences. But at the same time too, I don't think that we should box people into like needing to fit this particular idea of what we think that they should sound like or how they should act. And, even the type of music they should listen to or the type of food they should eat, like those things, those types of labels and assumptions should not be placed on people. Like people should be able to do whatever they want, enjoy whatever they want, and feel comfortable doing it.
Yeah, definitely. It sounds like definitely that's awesome. I love that. I love that perspective. It's very hopeful. And I heard somebody introduce you on one of the other podcasts as I think it was like a hope bringer or something like that. And I hear that in the way that you describe this, almost a dream of like, this is really the way I want it to be, which is the way it probably, it should be. So, I wanted to just ask a question around, did your mother, how did she talk to you about, if somebody asks you, this is how you explain who you are, or did she say, just tell them you're X or Y?
Yeah, that was one too that we really never had direct conversations with, but because my mom and I qualified for a bunch of, like government funded assistance, there were many times where I would be sitting in meetings with her and they would ask her like, what's your race or ethnicity? And she would always say white. And so anytime, I would go to fill out something, like whether it was at school or wherever it be, I would just always automatically select white. Like my mommy selects white, so I select white. Yeah. And I had this interesting, moment. I think I was toward the end of my junior year of high school, at the beginning of senior year, where I was starting to apply for scholarships in college and all of that jazz. And one of my teachers told me, she said, hey, Teisha, I know that, you're biracial, your mom is white. And, I'm looking through some of the scholarships and like the college applications that you're preparing. And I also see that you're marking white on these scholarships and applications. That is part of your identity, but also part of your identity is being a Black/African American. Mm-hmm. And she was very frank with me. And, I don't know how people are going to take this, but she was very frank with me and saying, it's going to be very valuable for you if you actually change your ethnicity on these applications to being Black/African American, because it's going to open way more opportunities for you than it would if you're white. Because there's so many white children out there, and there was like affirmative action and like all of these things, and so that was kind of the first time I realized, kind of like consciously thought about, should I be selecting white or should I be selecting black? And it was a challenge for me sometimes because, when you always have that thought in the back of your mind is they say these surveys are anonymous, but are they really? And if I tell them that I'm black, are they going to disregard me or overlook me for this job, for this college? And I was just like, I really loved it, a few years ago when applications started including 2 or more races. Like that's literally that I select that now every single time. And if I don't see that option on a drop down, I just refuse to answer the question.
Yeah. It's I feel the same way. I wonder how many surveys or application, metrics have been skewed because, like we see that and we're like, no, like this is not fair, so we just don't answer,
Yeah.
What were your sisters? Your sister, you say your next youngest sister was 14 years younger.
No, so my youngest sister was 14 years younger, but my next younger sister was about 2.5 years younger, and then 4.5, 7, and 11, 13, 14.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So I did want to ask the question about, had your parents back then, your mom or dad, or your, later on in life, talk about any of the hardships they face due to racism or prejudice?
I would say my mom really never had those conversations with me. I would have a couple of conversations with my dad. It was more so though around, growing up, especially like in the 60s, early 70s, being part of a Black family during that time, there had recently just been legislation put in place. And so more so it was around kind of like my father reflecting on his experience in school and, maybe there being segregation or, because of the area that he grew up in, he had to walk, this many miles to get to school because he just didn't have the access to the transportation like other children did. So I heard stories more so around that. I would say actually it was my grandma again, who was probably the first one who outwardly talked about race. And my grandma being my mom's mom, who again was a blonde white female. And it was actually on an MLK day. I want to say maybe in 2005 or 6. And she shared the story with me about, how she was working at this diner and there was, a Black woman there. They were both teenagers at the time. And she said that, the owner of the diner basically just talked really nasty to this Black woman. And she just said that, after that day, I really just tried to be friends with her and, always doing dishes with her or, busting tables and, just trying to be kind. And so I just, that was really the only story that I ever got. And I think from my mom, again, my dad wasn't really in the picture very often, but my mom, she had some interesting ideas. Obviously she was married to 2 Black men, but outside of that, she didn't really associate with the Black community. I grew up in the town I grew up in was a mixed Black and white town, but the specific community that I grew up in was kind of secluded from the rest of the town, and it was primarily white. Okay. And if my sister, 2 of my sisters kind of were able to actually identify more with the Black community when they were younger because, the Black community, for instance, if you listen to rap, you were more accepted. And my 2 sisters, were really into rap and hip hop. And, also, what the kids now, they were a little gangsta. And so, they were a little bit more accepted, but my mom didn't like those qualities. If they got caught listening to rap or if they happened to get in a fight, they would get in really big trouble. And so in a way, my mom tried to distance us from the Black community, I think because of her own prejudice against it. She said, we're going to stay in a primarily white community because, there's less crime, there's less of this. And, unfortunately, that can be very true. But at the same time, I think her reasoning from, deciding that, hey, we're going to specifically stay in this white community, I don't think that was right, because I think you could very well find a community that's very diverse and mixed.
Sure.
And is a much better way to raise your child, because you give them that exposure. And
Yes.
so I didn't really have exposure other than when I went to school. But again, when I went to school, I'm not really accepted by either side, because I don't tick the boxes on each side.
Yeah. And was there a time in maybe middle school, junior high school, where you were able to find solace in a place? A lot of times, guests talk about, oh yeah, they had these particular clubs, and
Mm-hmm.
whether they were affinity type clubs or other, were there places where you started to find, I'm starting to feel like myself here?
So we didn't have affinity clubs for, say, race or culture.
Okay.
But I was a musician, so I played violin all through high school. I also was what they would call a thespian, so I did like plays and musicals, and those kind of communities were really great, because they're kind of, again, like the groups of misfits kind of coming together. And I did definitely feel accepted in those types of environments. But I would say, I think it was actually going to college. Again, I was I was a first generation college graduate. And so I wasn't raised by parents who really kind of encouraged reading, although I love to read. Like, I read all the time. But I really never had kind of like these critical conversations where you're like leveraging critical thinking skills and asking challenging questions. Actually, whenever I would ask a challenging question, I would actually get in trouble for it, because I think in part my mom was embarrassed that she wasn't able to actually engage in a conversation with me on the question I was asking. But I think it was really kind of just going to college and recognizing that there was way more to the world, and that everyone else who was going to college most of them were coming from environments where they had been exposed to very diverse groups of people. And so I walk into this environment at university, and I'm not really being judged for being too white or for being tainted. It's like, oh, hey, you're cool. Well, they probably weren't saying that. I've never really felt cool. It just was a very different environment. And I think it's just the mindset. Like, when kids go to college, they're thinking of the future and thinking that there is something bigger out them. And they're in that learning mindset and that growth mindset. And so it's definitely, it was definitely really refreshing for me to kind of just go into that environment. And then, of course, growing up, they say the older you get, the better you know yourself. And so, after leaving college, it was really just discovering me and, realizing that, I'm going to be who I am, from a personality perspective. I can't change my color.
Sure.
So it's really just fine. I can't change my disability. And so it's really just finding people who are willing to accept me for me. And, I definitely suffer from anxiety, general anxiety disorder. And then I also have social anxiety. But it's really just, trying to finally get to a place where I'm okay with not having hundreds of friends. Like, I'm so okay with having just a handful of friends. And the ironic thing is that, I told you earlier that, a lot of the times people would assume that I was, Puerto Rican, or Dominican. And, actually 2 of my best friends today are, actually Latinx. So, and like so many of my friends are Indian and, just look so different. And so it's not even like today where I just have Black friends or just white friends. Like, my friends are literally come in all different, so many shades and sizes and colors.
So yeah, that's, did you ever feel, in your youth, anger or resentment towards, being either Black or white or being mixed?
Yeah, it was definitely, potentially was anger. I don't know if in the moment I thought of it as anger, but I think so. And, I felt anger a lot of having my disability, even though it's nothing you can change, but it's always that question of, like, why me? Like, why did my mom choose to, have children with this person? Were they And so, because you think about it, and it definitely makes life so much harder. And those of us who have to navigate life, being brown or black or having disabilities, the world wasn't made for us, and the world, unfortunately, doesn't really support us. And, there's so many myths and stigma and so many things that cause us shame. And, one thing that really comes to mind, I remember when I was about 18, 19 maybe, my mom was going to this rock concert with a bunch of friends. And, she went to the concert the next day. She's like, you buy the CDs or the merch and stuff. And so she was putting in the CD in to like kind of show my sisters like the concert that she went to. And, a bunch of my younger sisters just get up and start dancing around. And, it's like Linkin Park and 3 Days Grace and like all these bands from like the early 2000s. And my mom makes this comment. She was like, "Oh, look, my little black girls like rock music." And at the time, I don't really know why that just kind of shocked me, but I knew that there was something wrong with that statement.
Yeah.
And it kind of goes back to this idea again of these preconceived stereotypes and these boxes that the society puts people of different colors into. And apparently, only white children are allowed to listen to rock music. Only black children are allowed to listen to rap music. Thankfully, Beyonce proved us all wrong. But, it just made me think like my mom was actually part of the problem. And because I had only known her, I was only as educated as I was my grade in school. So, she wasn't very educated. And so I was really only exposed to her. And at that time, I think that was the first time that I realized that maybe I had also been exposed to certain ideas about what it means to be a certain race that maybe weren't true or that maybe should be challenged. And so, for a long time, I struggled. I didn't like calling myself white. I didn't like calling myself black. I felt like if I called myself white, I was kind of cheating. I felt like if I was calling myself black, that I was kind of cheating again, because I didn't really, from what I was told I had to be a black person, I didn't feel like I fit into the culture. And so about 5 years ago, I finally got to the point where I started calling myself and identifying as raceless, because I don't really feel like I fit into either bucket. I feel like I'm just a human, and that's my race. I'm human race. So
so you've mentioned a couple of times that you've had a visual disability. What is the visual disability, and has it been something that you've had all your life?
Yeah, so it's called retinitis pigmentosa, or RP. I was born with it, and it's a condition that it itself has a wide spectrum. Some people are born with it at its max capacity. Some people are born with full 20/20 sight, and then at some point in their life, there's just this huge vision dip that happens. I count myself very lucky that I was born with the max capacity that I will ever reach. So there's never been any progression in my vision, which means that I was born into this world and learned how to navigate it. And I've never really had to readjust the way I navigate the world. And I know that can be a really big challenge for other people who experience RP. And essentially it means I do have some usable sight. I have no central vision, just peripheral vision. So oftentimes when I look at people, I either have to look to the side or look up. So a lot of people will say like, why are your eyes moving all around? And so that's just how how my eyes have to navigate the world. And I can't see fine detail like eye color, for instance. I don't read print, so like small print. I actually use what's called a screen reader whenever I'm navigating on my phone. It's called VoiceOver, or when I'm navigating on my PC, it's called JAWS. And a screen reader essentially is just kind of like this voice that'll read everything to you on the screen, whether you're in like a Word document or on the web. It just kind of like reads everything to you. And so I can navigate around in some environments without any assistive mobile devices. But I have begun using a white cane more often since I've gotten older. So for me, depth perception is really hard. So being able to see like curbs or steps is really hard for me to see. During the day in a familiar environment, I'm pretty good to walk around on my own. But at night, it's really hard because usually it'll take someone like 15 seconds for their eyes to adjust. My eyes never adjust to the dark time night. So if it's nighttime or if I'm in an unfamiliar environment, I do try to rely on my cane, and it really helps me feel more independent. And I think what'll probably help people understand how well I can see is if, for instance, I know you, Antonio, in real life, in person, and we hang out. I'll, get a sense for like, how tall you are, how wide or slim you are, and kind of like your hair color, or like kind of like a shade of your hair, not necessarily the hair color. And so like if you're 5 feet in front of me, I'll be able to say, oh, hey, you're Antonio, hi. But say if you're like 15, 20 feet ahead of me, I'll be able to tell that there is a person there, but I won't be able to actually distinguish and say that person is Antonio.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that information. I mean, there's so much I want to ask you, but I'm going to that explanation of your visual disability, and we'll talk a little bit more about the awesome things you're doing now. Is how did that affect your relationship, or has it affected your relationship to race, or when you were younger? I know there's all those things that we learn, whether or stereotype based on, oh yeah, I saw that on TV, or this or that. But there's also instances when we are in person, and individuals, might have seen something on TV that made them have an adverse reaction, or they're like, oh, those Latinx males are, gangsters or whatever. But something like your visual disability, to a degree, takes that a little bit out of the question, because at a certain distance, you're kind of not able to see a lot of those differences of skin and things like that. So how has that changed your perception of identity, or do you think it has had a big effect on your perception of identity?
It definitely, I would say, for years did have an impact on my identity. Thinking about when I was younger, being blind or having a vision disability was just another thing for kids to judge me on.
Yeah.
When I got older and I started having friends, I can think of two scenarios, one when I was 18, another one when I was in 22, where I was in the car with someone and they happened to get pulled over for speeding. And when I was 18, I remember I was with my friend at the time. Mind you, she's a white blonde female. We get pulled over. It's probably like around 12 or so. Like we're 18, we're out, doing whatever. And the cops pull us over, go to give her a ticket, and then they see me. Of course, they're kind of like questioning both of us, and I'm unable to make eye contact with them. There's been so many times where I've been accused of being high because people assume that my kind of like wiggly eyes means that I've been, shooting up drugs or doing weed or whatever it is. And so in this particular instance, my friend and I are made to get out of the car and stand in the circle of about 6 armed police officers while they interrogate us, and have canines go and search her car for like 30 minutes.
Wow.
That was so scary for me. I'm this firstly, I'm this, I've never gotten in trouble. I'm a goody two shoes. I was the brown noser in school, straight A's, had a full scholarship on my way to college. And I'm like, and I have so much anxiety. That was an awful, awful experience.
I bet.
Obviously they didn't find anything.
No. I hope you enjoyed part 1 of this episode. Stay tuned for part 2, dropping soon, where you listen to your favorite podcasts. And don't forget to leave us a review, hit that 5-star rating, and subscribe. And what means the most is please share it with everyone you meet. Thank you for joining us for the Multiracialverse podcast. My name is Antonio Fernandez. You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Huge shout out to my friend Johannes Skoda for mixing and creating the intro music, and DJ Kazam for the track.